Welcome back, guys, to the JPS podcast, and this is episode 35 with the one and only Lyle McDonald, and this is a two-part installment of the podcast because Lyle and I went balls deep into some specific topics related to his recent woman's book, and we covered specifically today the female athlete triad and everything that comes with being a serious physique competitor or weight class athlete for strength sports or power sports. And you guys are really going to get an insight into just how knowledgeable this man is, as well as some key considerations in relation to amonerhia, so the loss of the menstrual cycle as a result of low energy availability and all of these things. So without further ado, I present to you part one of the Lyle McDonald Woman's Book series. So get a pen, get a pad, buckle up, and enjoy the show. What's that, sorry?
I didn't realize that the time differential would put you up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Awful.
There's probably only a handful of people who I would get up at such an ungodly hour for to talk to.
Sure.
And you're one of them. And
all right,
it's all the more worth it when I can see the progress with the man beard.
Yeah, that's pretty much the key. I think that's what I'm known for now.
How you doing, Lyle?
I'm well. Yourself?
I'm very well. How's the book been received?
I mean, enormously. After 3 years of hype and finally being out, and the internet has certainly changed since my last big book. So yeah, I don't think I've seen any really negative feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I have, I mean, if it's out, I'm sure it's out there, but for the most part, yeah. I'm waiting for someone to complain about, a man writing about women, which is fine, and I'm going to send a copy to this horrible website called Jezebel.com that they do clickbaity, extremist feminist type of stuff, and I'm going to send them a copy and take a bunch of stuff out of context just so that they'll rage against me and make a billion people just for publicity.
No, perfect.
Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, so far everyone's like, when's volume 2 coming out? I'm like, don't hold your breath. I usually take about 3 years between projects. The idea of going back to a second book is just tedious. It just fills me with dread. Like, a lot of it's written, which is easier, but it's still just like, I just want to sleep for a year. So we'll see.
Man, I think you deserve it. I won't lie, I haven't read the whole thing yet. Considering I got my hard copy just 7 days ago, but I plowed through it, and holy crap, like the level of detail. Like I knew it'd be good, but I was like, fuck.
Well, and that's now you know why it took me so long.
Yeah,
like this was just a nightmare project, and the deeper I got, the more complicated it got, and the way my brain works, like I have to just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. So, and women are just complicated. Men are easy. They really are.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Nah, I'm enjoying it so far. Like I put up a Facebook post when I got my copy and just said how even in the first, I think it was like the first page or two, your satire and just the wit that was just, I was just like, man, this is gonna be fun, and it's been fun to read, even though it's a very hard read. It's been fun, so well done.
Yeah.
Man. I really think it's a quality
especially
book.
Like it's the first 13 chapters is all background, like it's really just the physiology, which is kind of how I tend to write books. Like I've had people go, what, even if I don't use any of the information, like I always learn, like I always like to make sure people have that. Then really chapter 14 is kind of where it shifts completely. It's like, all right, here's all the back. Now here's like, and it's really just practical from there on out. But it's a lot of information to get through to get to that. I even thought about dividing it and be like, chapter 1 through 13 is just background, because a lot of that's going to go in the training book, because there's a lot of crossover. But then I was like, it's too much work. People will just skip chapters 1 through 13 or not buy it. So, but yeah, it's.
I definitely noticed that as well in reading it. The first 13 chapters, clearly was just covering, the basics, the very technical basics, and then obviously you finished off with some practical recommendations and stuff like that. But no, I thought it was really good. And what I wanted to talk today about, Lyle, on this podcast was not to have just another freaking discussion about the differences between males and females. I know you've done that ad nauseum.
Right.
And we know that women should eat more protein, do less dumb shit when it comes to reducing calories. So I don't want to go on about that any more than you do, believe me. So I wanted to really hone in on some of the specifics and key areas in the book that I had questions on personally for both my own clients, and I've also seen on the forums and whatnot, some women have had some very specific questions and stuff. So I wanted to dig into that, which I thought would be a little bit more beneficial to listeners and hopefully less tedious for you. So the first thing I thought we could start to dig into was to ask you, were there any pieces of information in the book that were not put in, or after writing it you felt that there was something that you could have added after publishing the book?
I don't know that there was, when I split the book up into volume 1 and volume 2, that caused a lot of difficulty because, volume 2 is going to be training. But since I had to talk about training for fat loss, I had, and I had to go back and add a lot of information. There's kind of that weird chapter 4 that's like training goals that's really out of place, like because it just didn't go anywhere else. And that was it's like we have this physiology, this weird chapter that just because it was needed for the terms that were going to come up later, like even in the body composition and those chapters. And one of the things I've always tried to do with my books, I can never know what my readership is or what their background is. And like I saw a criticism of make no mistake, it's a very good book. But someone is like basic terms like sets, reps, just it's easy to forget when you've had a background in this that not everyone entering this even has those base. So and I get criticism on both ends. The people who are advanced don't want to go, well, fine, just skip it. This, and I'll even say like this is basic. Like if you know what a set and a rep is, just move on. You don't need this section. But if I don't put that in, the beginners are lost. So that was, but anyway, so I did pull a lot of the details of training out that just because they were originally in there, and there's this thing was getting up towards 400 pages. I'm like, it's going to be 600 when all is said and done. So that was a lot of it. And it was just staying away from just a lot of the detail stuff. One little minor section, I thought about talking about body temperature and metabolic rate dieting. And because I dug into it one day and, body temperature is a rough indicator of overall metabolic rate in terms of like thyroid hormone, nervous system. Dan Duchesne, I believe, is one of the first to recommend, tracking that during a fat loss diet. And, as I talked about in the book, women see an increase in body temperature in the second half of their cycle, basal body temperature, which has been used for decades at least as an indication of when they're fertile. Because that occurs right after the egg is released. So I thought about and I actually, of course, found data that women's resting body temperature is, the 98.6. A, that's an average for everybody. B, of course, women and men do run a little bit differently. This has been a big thing. This is a big news story, I think, last year. And, anybody with a brain would have told you this. Women and men run at different temperatures. Women and men, if you're living together, they're always fighting over what, the temperature that keeps women warm.
Especially menopause, when menopause hits.
Yeah, it changes. I joked. There's also women tend to store more temperature centrally around the midsection, and their hands and feet are always cold. And that's sort of an obvious adaptation to keep the fetus healthy, right? And there's an old aphorism my mom relayed to me, which is for women, it's warm heart, cold hands, warm heart. And just kind of, and I've joked, well, not joked, but there's a reason that people often get into relationships in the winter. On top of being lonely, women want a man that they can put their hands and feet up against to steal our body heat. And that's not like I'm half joking and really half not joking. But yes, it was this big thing. And it was like, oh, office temperatures, which have been set by men firm, are not optimal for women. So I looked into this, and women's body temperature is, of course, a little bit different. And the same way everything else is different. But it was just like kind of this minor section that didn't really, I don't know that most people are going to track that on a fat loss diet, and it just gets into too many variables. But other than that, there's a couple, again, most of what got pulled out is going to go in the training book. Awesome. Probably if there's one section I kind of just because it does come up a lot is the effect of hormonal birth control on athletes. I'm actually even considering writing a very small, guys, can you just stop? Please? My dogs are getting rambunctious. Guys, please stop. I know you're lonely, guys. Just because there's a lot of questions and misconceptions about it, and actually one of the top female powerlifters, like she's poised to, I think, do a 4 times body weight deadlift, came in my group and said, my OBGYN gave me the Depo-Provera shot, which is a very high dose progesterone injection. How will it affect my training? And I'm like, you're screwed. Like, you're screwed for at least 3 months, possibly 6, because this is like, but the non-sports doc, they don't, she was told this won't impact your sports performance. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that. And there's pros and cons to hormonal birth control. In terms of, when they first came about, there was actually, it was considered a miracle for female athletes because they could regulate their performance and body weight and cycles, right? Let's say you're a female Olympic athlete. You know that during week 3 of your cycle, you perform badly. If your world championships falls in that week, if you're Olympic gold medal comp, guess what? You're out of luck. You're the last 4 years of your training and possibly your career. If this is your last Olympics, you're SOL. Yeah. So the idea was that you could use birth control to regulate the cycle. The problem is that, guys, stop it. The problem is that for certain types of activities, it can hurt trainability. And a lot of that depends on the type of hormonal birth control that is being used. So, like I said, this athlete, basically her year is destroyed. And for strength power sport, depending on how old she is, like she may be past her. If next year she's hit her prime, she's screwed. And the unfortunate reality is, hormonal birth control is used for its obvious reason. To prevent pregnancy. It's used to regulate the cycle. Women that have very painful menstrual cycles often use it, etc. But it can even if the average effect is nil, and a lot of the early work was on endurance athletes, and I don't know if you know endurance sports much, but when you're an endurance athlete, if your performance is down 5%, it doesn't matter. You can always go grind miles. I don't care how badly I felt. I can always go put in the low intensity miles, no matter how, your interval. But even then, there's just huge variability in how the menstrual cycle impacts this, but birth control, certain types. So I would have liked to have probably had that in there, but it's really more of a training issue. Like in the book, you read the chapters I really focused on. Does it cause weight gain? Does it impair fat loss? Everything else really was just pulled out for the training books. I don't think there's any topics I really left out. I mean, at 438 pages.
Yeah, I was going to say, you'd hope not.
I think anything I would have come up would have been either such a minuscule topic, or it would have been relevant to such a tiny, like, in as much as I spend a lot of time on, physique competitors and strength power athletes and athletes trying to reach 12% body fat, which is already, maybe 10% of the general population. Anything I think I would have discussed would have been, 1% of that 10% and just wouldn't have been. I'm sure some women wish I had addressed the drug use more or the drug issue. In all of my books, that's always a choice. And if you look at my overall book, I either do or I don't. There's really no, UD2, I mentioned a couple at the time, but I find that if I put in detailed drug information, number one, the people who want to use drugs, which is fine. I don't care either way. Just be honest about it. They're unhappy that there's not enough detail, but the people who will never use drugs are really put off by it. And honestly, from a business perspective, the people who be put off of it far outweigh the people who
definitely
see it. I would rather write a separate book.
Yeah.
In as much as that's really not my area of expertise, but I kind of, I mentioned it very obliquely, and I just kind of point out that when you see top athletes, especially in the physique world, one of the little dirty secrets we don't hear about is even when we got away from hardcore female bodybuilding and things like classic physique and figure and fitness became much more popular, there is much milder, admittedly, but there is a small amount of drug use going on, whether it's a little bit of anabolic steroids, clen, thyroid, that little extra bit. And the women who succeed with certain approaches and don't report problems who may be doing that, I don't want to say that they're all doing it, tend to give a very false perspective to those that aren't. And they don't, the naturals, just like male bodybuilding, the natural male, I used to see guys complain. They're like, I'm 185 and lean, but I'm still small. Like, no, you're not. By every objective value, you are bigger than most men in the world. You cannot compare yourself to Dorian Yates and these 280-pound behemoths that are taking a gram of steroids a day. And I think that happens a lot with women. So I didn't really, that. I guess I could have addressed it, but it just wasn't
the place.
Yeah, well, it just wasn't the place to do it.
Yeah.
So, and performance enhancing drugs, I probably know more about the fat loss end of things. Steroids have just never been really my interest. So, other than some generalities. So like I mentioned it a little bit, talk about, you see, I think one thing I pointed out, or maybe this is in the training book, whenever you see like a European or a Chinese or Russian coach that can only ever make great female athletes, there's a reason for that, and it's because females respond better to steroids. That's just flatly, if their training doesn't work for both women and men, it's because it's drug fueled. There's just absolutely no doubt about performance sports. So probably maybe that, but I can't really think of any physiology that I didn't cover to one degree or another. Like
it is very comprehensive. Extremely comprehensive.
Yeah, that's why it took so damn long. Yeah, and listeners who aren't familiar with it, because a lot of the questions I see tend to be, do you talk about menopause? Do you talk about polycystic ovary syndrome? And I did not talk about and I did not talk about disease states because that's just volumes, and I'm not a medical practitioner. It's just that's something you need to talk. And women's systems are more sensitive. They can have things go wrong for any number of problems, or any number of reasons. But polycystic ovary syndrome is one of the most common sort of reproductive. I hate to use the word dysfunction, but it is like they're metabolic dysfunctions. I don't want any women to go like, oh, he said I'm defective as a woman. No, it is just there are metabolic issues. I addressed that because it's very common in sport, especially the elevated testosterone version of it. Menopause, a lot of things change. And so in this book, part of why it's so long is I covered what I call the normally cycling, and that's just a woman that has, the traditional menstrual cycle. Again, normal does not imply abnormal. For the rest, I talk about menstrual cycle dysfunction, and there's 4 different levels of that. Talk about PCOS, and also a related sort of slightly elevated androgen levels. I talk about, I mentioned that, loss of menstrual cycle, amenorrhea goes with menstrual cycle, and I talk about perimenopause, and I talk about the changes that occur at menopause, and then whether hormone replacement therapy is or is not instilled. And then I had to do that for every single topic in as much data as there, and then try to address all the different training goals, which include general fitness and health, bone density, what I call the serious trainee, which is the person training, 4 or 5 days a week at a higher level than general fitness, but who's not competitive. The endurance performance athletes, the high intensity performance athlete, which is like track sprinters, track cyclists, swimmers, mixed, which is mainly team sports and MMA, and then physique athletes. So start to multiply all that out. In the first draft of the book, I actually had, towards the end of the book, you'll see there's charts of like, here's the menstrual cycle, here's how it interacts with the different components. This is how you kind of stack it on top of
nutrition.
In the original draft of the book, I did one of those for every hormonal situation and every goal. And it was just me staring at tiny little boxes for days. And I drew them all out, and mostly redundant, which is why I took all of it out. Like it's so repetitive that it really wasn't useful. But you can see that the number of possibilities just because of the different hormonal situations, and because that affects which diet you might set up, which supplements might be appropriate, what changes occur across a monthly training cycle. And there'll be more of this, I think, in the training section because of the potential for these things to impact on how strong a woman may be on any given day. Her performance can change even for endurance time trials. Like there's going to be, in as much as it impacts diet and supplements, it has also the great potential to impact on how training might ideally be set up. So, hi, buddy. Hi, buddy.
So I guess that that last segment in terms of the hypothalamic amonerhia, loss of menstrual cycle, that sort of ties in with where I wanted to take our first discussion today. In that the objective when trying to get extremely low body fat percentages or for weight class athletes, I want to talk specifically about those who are trying to reach the upper end of what is possible physiologically in terms of their body composition. The goal is not to get full blown hypothalamic amonerhia, and I guess it's extremely common for physique competitors or anyone who adopts any form of extreme dieting, exercise, all this. And obviously, I guess the question becomes, and I know you discuss this in your book, obviously, how can females who are trying to get on stage, make a weight class sport, or just, get seriously lean, for example, if they're a model or a bikini model and, their livelihood is dependent on, their conditioning, how can they maximize the structure of their microcycle in terms of diet and training to minimize the likelihood of it occurring, or at least delay, when it comes on.
And that's kind of, sort of just so for some background, right? Amenorrhea is complete lack of a menstrual cycle. It's defined as less than 3 cycles per year. Most women who develop it will pretty much not menstruate at all. Now, amenorrhea can be caused by a lot of, technically hormonal birth control will eventually cause amenorrhea, and I'm not talking about that. There's a number of medical conditions that can cause it. The one I focus on in the book is what's called functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, and all this means is that the hypothalamus, which is the big structure in your brain that kind of tells everything else what to do, senses things like training load, stress, and predominantly energy availability, which I'll define here in a second. And when it sort of it's the same structure that's involved in just general dieting adaptations, which is kind of what this is, right? When we diet as a man or a woman, the brain goes, oh, we're not eating enough, we're losing body fat, slow metabolic rate, yada, 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 to try to stay alive. And so I'm very specifically focusing on that menstrual, that specific type. And unfortunately, it tends to be a diagnosis of exclusion. What happens in a medical situation is they look for every other cause, and if they can't find it, they kind of default to that, which I think is a little misguided, because there's a classic hormonal signature of when this starts to occur. And sort of as a slight more background, right? So way back in the day, when they first realized that in the U.S. at least, female athletes really didn't start entering sport till the late 70s. Title 12 in the U.S. required that women have equal access, in premise anyway, to sport. And in the 80s, they started to see all these hormonal problems that men just didn't have, right? Men don't have a menstrual cycle to lose. But at the time, the technology, they didn't have good technology. They didn't really know what was going on. And so what they saw were two things. They saw women who was menstruating, which is called eumenorrhea. Eu just means good or normal. They saw amenorrhea, which was a complete loss of cycle. And they also saw oligomenorrhea, which is an infrequent cycle every 35 to 90 days. And originally, oligomenorrhea and amenorrhea were grouped. And they were thought to be part of the same phenomenon, and now we know that at least a fairly large portion of oligomenorrhea is caused by women because what they saw in oligomenorrhea is that women had elevated testosterone levels, and they went, oh, oligomenorrhea causes the elevated testosterone. It's the opposite. Women who have typically polycystic ovary syndrome, which can be marked by 2 to 3 times normal testosterone. There's another thing I talk about, the subclinical, 20 to 30% more. That disrupts the menstrual cycle. However, oligomenorrhea can develop as part of a sequence. And the difference is if a woman hits puberty and has always had an irregular menstrual cycle, it's PCOS related, right? She didn't hit puberty and suddenly have dieting training issues generally. if oligomenorrhea develops from, if a woman has a normal menstrual cycle, is normally cycling, and develops oligomenorrhea, it's part of this sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And I say sequence because in the early days, all they could measure was normal or gone or infrequent. Now we know that there's 2 stages in between, which are called subclinical menstrual cycle disorders. The first one is called luteal phase defect. That means that the luteal phase, it's the second half of the cycle, don't produce, it can shorten, or it just typically is marked by insufficient progesterone. The problem is the cycle is typically still the same length. The woman still menstruates, but she's infertile. And this progesterone can't maintain the lining where the egg would normally develop. But to her, she'll look completely, if you did a blood test, you would see lowered leptin, lower T3, lowered IGF-1, elevated cortisol slightly. But they don't do that because the woman has no reason to think that there's anything wrong unless she's trying to get pregnant. The next step is anovulation. The egg is not being released. Cycle's still the same. They're still bleeding. Nothing, but if you did a blood test, you would see lower leptin, lower T3, lower metabolic rate. It's weird. Oligomenorrhea as part of the sequence just doesn't seem to develop that frequently, or if it is, I wasn't seeing it talked about. And then the next stage is amenorrhea. So we now have this sequence from normal to these 2 middle stages that can't be determined because everything looks totally normal until a woman develops, and it's been referred to, as it's just sort of this invisible menstrual cycle dysfunction because without blood work, there's just no indication. So we've got this sequence that goes, and things get progressively worse. And by the time you're amenorrheic, T3 is very low, insulin-like growth factor is very low, leptin is very low, cortisol is very high, metabolic rate may be reduced by 20% from normal, immune system function, a whole lot goes wrong. There are a couple of very minor advantages, and I don't want women to latch onto these. Like, obviously, many women like not having a monthly cycle to deal with for fairly obvious reasons. A lot of the normal cyclical changes in body weight go away, so it makes tracking the diet a lot easier. Mm-hmm. Since they're not losing as much blood, they're losing less iron every month. But these are very minor compared to the big drawback, which is potentially permanent bone mineral density loss. And that is that can't be, unless you're getting a DEXA every year, you don't know that women don't know that that's occurring either. It is this silent aspect. So it turns out, and there was for years they're trying to figure out what caused it, because they typically saw amenorrhea in athletes whose sports focused on thinness. So here we're talking about runners, cyclists to a lesser degree, ballet, gymnastics, things of that nature. It was related to running volume. But they saw when they did early studies, they would throw women into just these enormous amounts. And it was seen in weight loss. So there were all these things going on. And still, just because I like bringing up this story, my favorite theory about what causes this is breastfeeding can cause, done properly, is actually a very good form of birth control. Not the way we do it in the Western world, but if you look at sort of extant hunter-gatherer societies, the kids come in and breastfeed every few minutes. That elevates prolactin, and that inhibits normal reproductive function. And the theory was that women who were jogging, that their breasts were getting nipple stimulation from their sports bras, and that was elevating prolactin and causing loss of the menstrual cycle. I think that's my favorite. The one that really took the most hold was the body fat theory. Whatever. I found that in some random bit of trivia. And
that was so good.
Yeah. And so early on, the researchers thought that the big criteria here was body fat percentage. It was this was almost universally seen in very lean athletes. It made logical sense, right? We knew it had been observed that little girls had to hit a critical body fat percentage to start menstruating, right? This makes logical sense. Women's body fat exists to support pregnancy, support fetal development and breastfeeding. If she doesn't have enough body fat, she's probably still starving. It made sense that the system wouldn't turn on before that. The reverse logic then became, well, if she goes below a certain body fat percentage, it makes logical sense for that to turn off. The problem was that women were starting to be seen at varying body fat percentages, and you would see a woman at, say, 12% body fat near the lower limit who was still menstruating. Now, she probably had one of these subclinical disorders. They just weren't known at the time. But you'd see women at 18% that weren't menstruating. So if there was this singular critical number, well, there wasn't. There clearly wasn't a singular critical number. So I'll come back. It turns out body fat percentage is related indirectly, but it's not really the primary driver. So fast forward to like the 2000s, and a researcher named Lukes, because the problem is, all right, one study took a bunch of young girls at camp, it threw them into like 10 miles a day of running with 2 hours of activity, like right off the bat. And most of them got menstrual cycle dysfunction, but the women who lost more weight, it was 100%. But how do we separate this out? If we've got dieting is low calories. Is it training stress? Is it training stress plus weight loss? You can't separate these out because they're all related. So Ann Lukes came through and she defined a concept called energy availability. And what you can think of that as is calorie intake minus exercise energy expenditure, right? This isn't energy balance. And this is kind of a confusing, it's a little bit different, right? So if you're eating 1,800 calories a day, and you're burning 400 calories a day in exercise, your energy availability is 1,400 calories. And those are the number of calories left to support all the body's systems, right? Every day as we sit here, your brain is using calories, your heart is using calories. It takes energy to, maintain ion gradients across tissue, kidney function, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And another early paper, he basically argued that, there are relatively more or less critical systems in the body, right? If your brain stops working, you die. If your body stops making hair or fingernails, you're all right. And that's actually a known effect of extreme dieting. It's called telogen effluvium. I don't know why. Go look it up. But a lot of people note that their hair their nails get real brittle. Because why would the body spend energy on your fingernails when it doesn't have enough to go around? Reproductive function, obviously, is also not critical for immediate survival, right? It's critical for long-term survival of the human race. I would also argue that if there's not enough food available, right, and realize that this would have developed, this was before we did sport for fun. This was when if food isn't available, then that is not a good time to get pregnant, because you don't have the calories to support fetal development, which causes its own set of issues. The odds of it surviving to to age 5, which is about when infant death rate goes down significantly, is almost nil. So this is all kind of how this system kind of logically developed. And what she found initially, and what she did was an elegant study. She took untrained women, 5 days, and she either lowered energy availability by keeping food intake the same and just jacking up their exercise, or she kept their exercise the same and dropped their food intake. But she generated the same energy availability, because which one you adjust, if you eat 1,800 calories and do 400 of exercise, it's 1,400 energy availability. If you eat 1,400 calories and do 0 activity, it's 1,400. So it is identical in that regards. What she found was that with a very low energy availability, all of this standard hormonal picture showed up. Low T3, lowered metabolic rate, elevated cortisol. More importantly, she found there's a hormone called luteinizing hormone. It's released. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. This is what controls reproductive function. So in women, FSH is involved with developing the follicle, the egg. Luteinizing hormone tells the ovaries to make hormones. In men, it's, I believe, FSH is sperm production and LH is testosterone. So very similar. And what she found was decreased luteinizing hormone pulsatility, which meant that the pituitary gland was sending less of a signal to the reproductive organs. Now, I'm not saying she saw the development of menstrual cycle dysfunction in 5 days, but she saw the hormonal profile that down the road will lead to it, right? So, and she identified that it was this energy availability, and again, almost regardless of how you did it, exercise had a little bit less impact for reasons it's in the book, and I don't want to go into it. But for the most part, it was identical. So then her next step was, because she just created this, it was like 5 calories per kilogram of lean body mass. And this is normalized to lean body mass. That's how energy availability is defined, because lean body mass is what uses the calories. So first she just created this staggering low energy availability. But then she wanted to find out, is there a critical point? Like, is it a threshold? Is it a continuum? So she did the same study and went from like 40, 30, 20, 10. And everything was fine until they had about 30 kcals per kg of LBM, which is 13.6 kcal per pound LBM. And that's when the problem started. So boom, critical threshold. And it turns out that if you kind of math this out in reverse, that's about resting metabolic rate. So basically, if your energy availability goes below and that also makes logical sense, right? Your resting metabolic rate is the calories needed to maintain your basic functions. If you're eating less than that, your body has to make an important choice of what it's going to turn off. So reproductive system. So boom, we got this critical threshold. And it was then suggested that 45 kcal per kg LBM was considered sufficient for athletes. And if you reverse math that out, it's around 17 to 20 calories per pound, which is, I want to say 38 to 40 some odd. It's right about the numbers we've typically used for maintenance. Right? Usually strength physique athletes use far less calories. Endurance athletes are burning an absolute shed load. So that number got established. And still there were some issues. This is a 5-day long study. It was untrained individuals. Are they different? Observationally, they found that, and let me make sure I phrase this correctly, all women with amenorrhea were below the critical threshold. But all women below the critical threshold did not have amenorrhea, right? So they had to be below it, but being below it didn't guarantee it. If that hopefully that will parse through. So clearly there was a little bit more going on. Now, so I can almost guarantee that the women who did not have full-blown amenorrhea, they had one of those subclinical dysfunctions. But for whatever reason, and in the research, this frustrated me for a year, the researchers would talk about women who were more robust. And nobody ever defined what it meant. It just bothered me. It was just kind of this, they're more robust. We're just going to hand wave this because we don't know. And there's a genetic component. It has been shown that women who have what's called a higher reproductive age, and this is the number of years a woman has been menstruating. So she started at 12 and she's 18, her reproductive age is 4, started at 12 and she's 28, and reproductive age is 16, not biological, is above a 14-year reproductive age, women's systems become more robust. So, and this explained earlier studies where studies of younger girls invariably saw the development of amenorrhea, but running studies of older women didn't. So that basically she developed this model that sort of put it all together, right? Low energy availability is going to occur if you're dieting, obviously. If you do a tremendous amount of activity and don't raise food intake, you are creating a low energy availability state. If you do activity and you lose weight, you're obviously in a low energy availability state. So this kind of put this all together into a very coherent picture. And even when she looked at body fat percentage, right, on average, women with amenorrhea have like 2% less body fat than women without, but the range is like 12 to 24%. So like the 2% doesn't matter relative to the range. So we've got all these different factors kind of contributing. So this, which is a long way to get to your question, which is how can women avoid this? Right now, in premise, never go below that threshold. But which is great on paper, but there's two problems. One is that for women to get sufficiently lean, they will have to cross that threshold. There is simply no way to get to that 10 to 12% body fat without doing it. There's another issue, and this was, luckily, thank God it took me so long to write the book because some good papers came out towards the end. And one found that they were starting to identify women with amenorrhea that were at like 32 to 34 energy availability. Like it was a little bit above. Now this makes sense, right? 5 days, like I can diet someone for 5 days and I'm not going to see a lot of changes. But no matter what deficit they're on, if I diet them for 3 months, as they lose body fat, you're going to see progressive changes. And that's the difference here, is it's long-term low energy availability versus very short-term. And going back to the body fat real quickly, one thing that's been known for years, lean women are much more at risk of developing amenorrhea. Overweight women never do, unless you do like bariatric surgery, at which point energy availability drops from all the calories to 0, like literally overnight. But for the most part, it was only women who were below like 22 to 24% body fat. So that suggests that body fat, and it's of course leptin, because of course it is. And if leptin is below a certain level, there seems to be a critical leptin level. But since leptin is responding to both body fat and energy and calorie intake, body fat is only permissive. It's part of it, but it's not, it can't explain all of it. So again, the one theory would be, oh, just never go below that level. Well, good luck. Now, do note that, okay, let's say a woman hits 12%. She's no longer dieting, so she can raise her calories to some degree, right? So that she's now at maintenance. This will automatically raise her energy availability. Now, whether or not that will, resume menstrual cycle function is that's a bigger question. And I'll come back. There's a case study I reported on right at the very end of the book on a female runner. So how do women, the reality is for a woman to get to 10 to 12%, she will get some degree of menstrual cycle dysfunction. That is unavoidable. Now, whether or not she will get full-blown amenorrhea, I think in most cases it's more likely to happen than not. It's clearly not universal. She's a little bit older, she's probably less likely to, but a lot of it depends on how women diet. And this is really kind of what you were getting at that I got to in a very long way, which is, so there are actually two really good case studies in the book of physique athletes that really point out good and bad ways of dieting, right? So the first dieter she's like 22% body fat. She was eating like 42 calories per kg LBM. Energy availability, she started 6 months out. She induced a very moderate deficit. She did lose her cycle 1 month out, but she made it 5 months through her diet without losing, because it took her that long to reach the critical threshold by starting with a higher body fat percentage and a higher calorie level, right? And Eric Helms, his goal for his physique competitors, the way he puts it is, you want to start your diet eating as many calories as you can without gaining body fat, which is just a very indirect way of saying you want to start with the highest energy because it gives you the highest baseline. Because that way you can cut 20% out and you're still only at 38. And then when you have to cut 10%,
the pre-contest diet.
Yeah, basically. And that's where, a month, for the final month before they start their diet, it's kind of a stabilization phase. He wants them eating as many calories as possible without gaining body fat. Because again, if you start at 42 calories per kg LBM, 42 energy availability, and you cut it 20%, you're now at 38. You're fine. You cut it 10% more, and now you're at 35. Eventually you're going to get there. It's a matter of delaying it as long as possible. Now, in contrast, there was another physique competitor. She started at like 16% body fat, and her energy availability at the beginning of her diet was like 32. She was already near the critical, and I bet if they'd measured it, she probably already had a subclinical menstrual cycle disorder. She went below the critical threshold her first week of the diet. She lost her menstrual cycle a month in, which meant she didn't have it for like the next 5 months. There was a secondary issue, which is after the diet. Well, we'll come back to menstrual cycle recovery. Let's just talk about avoiding missing it, losing it in the first place, right? So and yes, they're case studies. It wasn't comparative, but this is a general observation, right? Women, if you're starting at a lower energy availability to generate fat loss, you're going to go below it instantly, and you're going to induce those adaptations immediately. That's going to cause problems sooner than otherwise. The other thing to do, and this came out very indirectly, and this I'll go back to a couple of studies. So Ann Lukes knew in animals that if you starve them for 5 days and then refeed them for a day, everything goes back to normal, right? The old refeed thing, when I was writing about in 2004. She wanted to see if this worked in humans. So she did the standard 5-day low energy availability. And then, oh my God, she gave these women, I forget the numbers, but it was like 7,000 calories. It was something that was just
heaven.
Awesome. It was just awesome. I'm sure they had trouble eating it all. And over that one day, she saw zero recovery of hormones. Zero. And anyone who's listened to some of my recent podcasts, I've talked about this, whether or not a one-day refeed has any utility metabolically, not from the standpoint of glycogen and yada, yada, yada. So there was another study that wasn't even looking at this. And what she did by Olson, and she did 3 days of actually fasting, which is about as low energy availability. You can actually have a negative energy availability. If you have like a gymnast eating 400 calories a day and training for 8 hours, she'll actually have negative energy availability. And that's endemic to that sport of ballet too. So she generated low energy availability for 3 days, saw the same cluster, the same hormonal snapshot. And then she just let the women go back to maintenance for 2 days and then just happened to remeasure hormones. Boom, everything went back to normal. So what we can sort of infer from that, and again, I've been talking about this recently, is at least infrequently, 1 refeed every 5 days is not sufficient to impact hormones, but 2 every 5 days is, right? And just as a plug, so my Ultimate Diet 2, which is one of my earlier books, as I've gone back to that, it's probably more optimized for women than for men. Sheerly by luck, make absolutely no mistake, this was not deliberate, but it has 4.5 days of very low calories. It has 2 days of maintenance or above calories, and then 1 day that it's maintenance or a little bit below. And I had women who were dieting to contest levels without losing their menstrual cycle. And now Eric and I discussed this for like a year, because what he has seen is, okay, so we know that 1 refeed day or 1 maintenance day every 5 days is insufficient once you're below critical threshold. What if you're doing a maintenance day every 3rd day? Or what if you're doing 2 days a week, but they're not sequential, right? So maybe you diet Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays at maintenance, Thursday, Friday, however you structure it. And there's no data there, mind you, but from a hormonal standpoint, right, we know that there's a lag time. Like even when you start to diet, you don't start to get hungry till like day 4. It takes there's like the brain has to kind of notice that you're dieting, if that makes sense. So like there's kind of this idea that maybe if you reverse things every 3rd day, it will sort of limit that. And then again, 2 or 3 days later, you're doing it. And a lot of this depends on where you are in your diet, right? If your energy availability is still at 40, you don't have to worry about this. It's late in the diet that's become, and what he's seen empirically is that by having his athletes diet like harder for 3 or 4 days a week, but then have 2 or 3 days of maintenance as they get closer to goal, that they do typically still lose their menstrual cycle, but it happens a lot later. And that's really kind of what we're looking at. And this is just mainly to limit what is really truly physical damage, right? I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that the loss of the menstrual cycle can cause bone mineral density loss. Women already, this is a potential, and I realize a 22-year-old physique competitor doesn't give a damn. For me to say, when you're 70, this is going to predispose you to osteoporosis. Nobody at 22 cares about any of that. But this is not a joke. There is also evidence that if she gets her menstrual cycle back, the bone density can be regained if she trains properly, which means heavy resistance training, high peak loading, sufficient calories, sufficient calcium, vitamin D, etc. But this is on top of all the other things. Your training will go into the toilet. Your metabolic rate is in the toilet. Hormones are all messed up. There's a lot of amenorrhea is not a healthy state to be in. So you want to both delay its occurrence. Ideally you avoid it completely. You're going to get luteal phase defect, probably in ovulation at the very least. You want to avoid it not only as long as possible by dieting, I would say rationally or just non-pathologically. Like, I'm not saying you can do an extreme diet, right? I've written extreme diets, my Rapid Fat Loss Handbook, but for a lean athlete, it's only 2 weeks and then ends with 3 days of maintenance calories, right? You can get away with this for short periods of time. There's no doubt about it. The problem is that women try to do this for extended periods with 2 hours a day of aerobics. On 12, their energy availability is just tanked. They're just, and they're actually, I said, I just want women to consider this, that if you diet too hard for even 5 days, you can lower metabolic rate slightly in only 5 days of bad dieting. Again, if you add, if you put in a refeed or whatever every 4 or 5 days, it's not a big deal. But that's not what women do. Typically, they cut their calories hard and they keep them there. Well, when they're not having potential binge eating episodes, which is a whole separate issue. Then when fat loss slows, where do you go now? Right? So you're starting at 32, right? You've now reduced your energy availability. You're already doing 90 minutes of aerobics. What do you do when fat loss slows? What do you do now? Right? And again, Eric, and so if folks who don't know, he gave me he wrote an appendix for the book and actually gave me constant feedback, and I'm happy to say that all of my theoretical research-based ramblings basically matched up what he's found to work in practice, which is always nice when that works out. And his thing on aerobics is do as little as you need to get to your goal. Which is not to say, he's not saying do none, right? The typical pre-contest approach is eat as little as you can and do an hour of aerobics morning and night, right? Now, some smaller women may need that at the end. That's just the reality. If you're a 120-pound woman, your calories will hit a point that they can't go any lower. If you're doing 60 minutes of cardio and your weights, you might have to do more. But do it because you need it, not because that's just the way it's always been done. That's kind of the difference here. And you bring it in gradually, right? And that's sort of the other key is there's at least some indication that women's bodies just don't like big rapid changes, especially if they're maintained in the long term. Like I said, you can get away with this for a couple of weeks. But the women who are ending up at a low energy availability, they may have started at 42, and yes, they're at 30, but it happened over a 5-month span. And that's the difference. And same thing with the aerobics. They may have been doing 30 minutes 3 times a week. Fat loss starts to slow. They don't want to cut calories too much because they get hungry. So you add 10 or 15 minutes a week. And even if you go back before we knew about any of this stuff, if you looked at successful physique athletes who had experience, they would just every couple of weeks, they would cut their food intake by 100 calories, or they would add 10 or 15 minutes of cardio. And they might have ended up doing a lot at the end on fairly low calories, but that's just the reality, especially for physique more than endurance athletes, right? So there's another case study in the book that is a female cyclist who got injured and was put on a very rational approach by Louise Burke at the AIS, she's who I want to be when I grow up. She's just one of the top, not only clinical researcher, her applied sports nutrition, she blows me away. Like her book, Practical Sports Nutrition, is the best book on the topic I've ever read. Like she does fantastic applied research because the Australian Institute of Sport. So she put this female cyclist on a diet. The cyclist was at like 45 cal per kg LBM energy availability. She targeted like 35. Realized cyclists aren't trying to get to 12%. Mm-hmm. She increased her dietary protein. She lifted twice a week. But if you look at her calorie intake, it was like 3,000 calories. But realized that endurance cyclists do a ton of training. By the end of her 10-week diet, she was doing 2 5-hour bike rides a week. Right. And that's a couple, even for a smaller female, that's a good 2,000 calorie burn. So you can eat 3,000 calories and you're still at deficit. Right. So physique athletes, the reality is weight training burns a paltry number of calories. Low intensity aerobic burns up, even interval training doesn't burn a lot of calories. So physique athletes are just kind of limited in how much training that they're able to do. Endurance athletes, by dint of their sport, just do, an elite runner is running 20 hours a week. An elite cyclist is doing 30 hours a week, 25, 30 hours a week. But one thing I wanted to comment, going back to the amenorrhea thing, is so there's another case study in there, and it's of an elite female runner who they followed her career for 9 years. This was just like one of those studies that you have to wonder how just practically they did it. Because there's another issue, which is women want to stay lean year round, right? This gets to sort of the model example, or the reality is, if you're a physique athlete, if you're a fitness model, you have to stay pretty close to photo shape, or, it's your job. Mm-hmm. So how can a woman do that while at least, keeping herself as healthy, hopefully avoiding full-blown amenorrhea and avoiding these problems? And what they saw in this female runner is, during her off season, which is 9 months out of the year, she would increase her body fat to anywhere from 12 to 14%. And while eating sufficient calories with like a 40 to 45 energy availability, right? Again, she's running God knows how much a week, but she was and her menstrual cycle would come back during her base buildup. And then for I forget offhand, it was like 6 to 8 weeks, because she was very close. She was only a couple of kilos over her race weight, mm-hmm. but it was enough. It was enough to let her eat enough to normalize the system. And then as she entered her pre-competition phase, she would very gradually lose those 2 or 3 kilos, and she would become amenorrheic during her race season, which was 2 to 3 months. And then she would gain the 3 kilos back. So the thing was, she wasn't attempting to stay race lean year round, which just can't. But you do see that among physique competitors, and there is a reality. Admittedly, the average model is not generally having to maintain 12%. You're talking about fashion model. If you're a physique model, and you make your living that way, you probably are. But as long as you're not, trying, contest lean is a whole nother level of lean. right? You look at a woman at 15%, she'll typically have visible abs. She'll probably have some cuts on her legs, a little bit of dehydration, a couple pound fat loss, if she's got a photo shoot coming up or whatever. I don't know professionally how, if these women are expected to stay like this year round. I tend to doubt it. I tend to think they go, you've got a photo shoot coming up, you've got 6 weeks, 6 weeks or whatever. Well, if you're a couple pounds of fat within your goal, you know how to diet. You do a short little diet, you make your photo shoot, you look great, you do your gig, go up a couple pounds, make sure you're eating enough. I've got a friend here in Austin who did figure modeling for a while, or fitness modeling, and that's what she would do. She would just wait. She stays lean year round, lean enough. And then she had to do a contest photo shoot, and she would diet for 4 weeks and dehydrate a little bit, and she'd make it, and she'd come back up to, a healthier body fat percentage. I will say, because in the book, I sort of talk about healthy / sustainable and then optimal for gains. And those are not necessarily the same thing, right? Strength power athletes, physique athletes don't make good muscular gains trying to stay 16% year. And a lot of them want to, because they don't want to get fluffy. But it just, you can't eat enough. You're having to keep your calories so controlled. It's very difficult to do. So for like a female physique athlete, she may need to get to 22% body fat to make improvements in her muscle mass. What if she doesn't want to? If she's, like you said, a figure model or a fitness model, that's her profession, staying at 16 to 18% with sufficient calories may be perfectly viable for her. As long as, she might again have a slightly subclinical menstrual cycle disorder, but at least she won't have full-blown amenorrhea. Endurance athletes, like I said, this runner stayed, 12 to 14%, that's within the error bar of measurement. But she was eating enough, and really is the energy availability is the key thing here. It's when a woman tries to maintain 16% by just keeping her calories down and doing lots of cardio, and her energy availability is staying low. And sort of an oddity, and I hate to I mentioned this in the book, and I don't want to get into metabolic damage because we need to switch to menopause, but right, so there's a phenomenon you see online, right? The women who have been doing the high carb cardio grind for 2 years. They're just cardioing their damn brains out. They're not eating enough protein, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole cluster of problems that causes for most women. Then they get into the weight room and proper weight training. I don't mean pissing around with 3-pound dumbbells or any of that. They start lifting. And I'm not saying it has to be powerlifting. They're challenging themselves. Usually when that happens, their cardio gets cut way back. Their diet changes. And it's magic. It infuriates women because they're like, I've seen more improvements in 3 months than I did in 3 years with this other bullshit. Like, it's so frustrating. And there's a number of reasons that this is occurring. But I think one of them is that by cutting out all that cardio and cutting out all that calorie restriction, there is going to be an effect. If you take a woman who is currently below or even near the critical energy availability threshold, and suddenly she's eating enough, her metabolic rate will increase. And I don't want this to be heard as like, oh, she had the metabolic damages. Like, I don't want that to come out of what I'm saying, but there will be an effect. And she may, because that's what you hear from these women. I'm able to maintain on much, and there's other things. When you eat few calories, non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, you just don't move around. You're tired all the damn time. Weight training seems to have a slightly differential effect on meat for a number of reasons. You're eating more protein. There's a ton of stuff going on, but at least one of the things that's being removed is this low energy availability reduction in resting metabolic rate, along with all the other adaptations to essentially she's chronically dieting.
Yeah. And
when she stops doing that and removes that blocker, the magic happens. So I think there's also that. If you're 16% and you're trying to make gains, you're having to diet constantly to do that. And you're going to be causing yourself problems. If you can do it and keep your calories high enough, you should be able to maintain, but you should be menstruating if you typically have a menstrual cycle. Otherwise, you are very potentially losing bone density. And that's bad.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with a couple of key points. Number one is to structure the microcycle of the diet with aggressive or more fat loss focused days, and then having 2 to 3 days at maintenance calories. I think other take home points would be to have maintenance calorie intakes, or at least, bringing calorie intake up, periodically throughout the year, as opposed to continuously trying to diet. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about cognitive disinhibition. But I guess there's a case there for reverse dieting, even though, everyone's come out and completely bashed it and said that, hey, it's not, effective. The recovery diet's better.
Depends on how you're defining it to a great degree, because it's there, and that's part of the problem with some of the criticisms. And I've been guilty of this myself. I'll be completely honest. Is it has different meanings to different people, right? The reality is that until you're at maintenance calories, you do not get metabolic recovery. Yep. Period. Okay, this is not even debatable. The only real question is how long it takes you to get there. And this was kind of let me sort of back up. So we talked about how the dieter can avoid menstrual cycle dysfunction, or at least limit it, delay it. We talked about how, what they can do to try to maintain a lower body fat and still at least have some sort of normalization. But there's also the question of, okay, your diet's over. Now what? Right? What's the best way to restore normal menstrual cycle function?
Straight back to maintenance.
So like in an ideal theoretical world, it's go right back to maintenance.
But as I was saying, in terms of the physique athlete or the model who may, need to maintain a certain level of conditioning, if we reverse diet, we can, increase their energy availability slowly without that, rebound.
So, and that's kind of been the thing, right? The idea of reverse dieting is that you kind of slowly bring calories back up. And the idea was always to restore normal metabolic rate without getting fat. Unfortunately, the system doesn't work that way. It can't. And so the same two case studies, right? I talked about the one where the woman dieted very higher calories, gradual, blah, 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 and then the woman who started low. And what they did after their diet was actually also very illustrative. The rational dieter, and I realize that's kind of a loaded term, but in my opinion, that's how women should ideally diet. Right after the contest, she brought her calories back up. She ended up going right back to original body fat percentage, which again, for a physique athlete, she needed to get back to 22 to make gains for the next season. That may be very different. The other one, who started too lean to begin with, took 20 weeks to get her calories back to maintenance to avoid getting fat again. Well, guess what? She still ended up right back where she started. She actually ended up higher than she started. But the other consequence is, not only did she lose her menstrual cycle 5 months before her contest, it took her like a year and 7 months to get it back. Right? The first dieter got hers back instantly. She lacked a menstrual cycle for 2 months because she only hit very low energy availability for 1 month. She was right back to normal within the second month. And there's some there's some details, a lot of details in this in the book, right? In the simplest sense, the way to cure amenorrhea, hypothalamic amenorrhea, is to eat more and train less. Getting athletes to do it is the hard bit, but in premise, that's really what it takes. You have to raise energy availability. You can either reduce activity, increase food intake, or both. Usually what happens is you tell neurotic athletes to do this. Oh, they raise their calories, they just add a training day, or they train harder because they're exercise addicts and they're nuts because they're athletes. I was an athlete for 30 years. I get it. But there's at least some indication that the longer you've lost your menstrual cycle, the longer it takes to come back for some reason. It's highly variable, and I can't say with certainty that second case study that's why it took. But the point was that rather than having lost your menstrual cycle for 2 months, with bone mineral density loss happens over time, right? It might be 2 to 3% loss over a year, but that's also 2 to 3% loss versus the 2 to 3% you might be gaining. So you're actually negative 4 to 6 or whatever the numbers work out to. So the less of a time you can have that occur, the better. But this woman, like I said, she was without her menstrual cycle for like a year and 7 months because she just simply took way too long to get her calories back up to normal. So my general opinion, which has not changed in a couple of decades or in a decade plus, I don't want it to take more than 2 weeks to get to maintenance, because there is usually when people crap on reverse dieting and these slow increases in calories, the big argument for it, which I address and I don't disagree with, some people completely lose control of their food intake. right? There's some great studies back in the 80s, back in the old bodybuilding days when everybody dieted extremely, and food intake goes from like 1,200 to like 3,600 in a day. Like there used to be horror stories, and this was big male pros. They would gain 40 pounds in 2 days. Now it's water, right? It's all hydration, it's all glycogen and water, but just they were so dehydrated and so depleted going in, and there's almost the practical issue of good luck not raising your calories. When your hunger is just off the map, you may not be able to do it, which is then countered by there's such high dietary restraint levels in the dieters that get to this level. And I'm going to say something that is potentially very offensive is the wrong word, but it could come across the wrong way, and I want to really qualify it, right? Eating disorders are not a joke. It's actually, and it's something I really don't touch on in the book, not my area, that needs to be clinically dealt with, right? Whether it's anorexia, bulimia, eating disorder not otherwise specified, they are not a joke. Women are like 9 times more prone to them than men. They are no joking matter. However, even a subclinical eating disorder, I'm willing to predict that successful physique athletes all have one if they don't have an overt eating disorder. Yeah. And what I'm going to say next is what's going to sound so potentially offensive. I think that's part of why they're successful. Not that I'm justifying it, not that I'm saying it's a good thing, but I think without that degree of willing to embrace the hunger, which is something you hear on some of the pro-anorexia boards, you won't make it because you simply won't survive the diet. Right. Eric helps a little bit differently. He says, if you don't start out with an eating disorder, you'll end up with one, and which is unfortunately very true. But, so yes, on the one hand, your body is just telling you eat. But if you had the cognitive dietary restraint to get to 10%, you probably still have the cognitive dietary restraint to not raise your food intake unless you kind of flip that mental switch. And I do agree completely that that's where the rapid increases in calories can really, then you get into disinhibition, then you get into sort of that trigger that you go from one extreme to the other. And I do agree in that sense that having, a more gradual increase in calories can help maintain. And if you're trying to, if you're rebounding from 10 to 22 to 24, who cares? You got to get there anyway. Whether you do it in 3 months or 9 months doesn't make 3/5 of a difference. If you're trying to go from you hit 12% or you're trying to, you hit 14% for a photo shoot and you only want to go back to 16%, you can't afford to rebound to 20 because that's another 3-month diet. And if you get a gig in a month that they say, we need you in shape, you're out of luck, right? The physique competitor is going to rebound, still take a few months.
And they've got ideally more time in the off season.
For a year, right? They've got a year or whatever before they're going to have to diet again. Yeah. If fitness is your profession and your appearance is your profession, you can't afford that to occur. So I think this gets back to it's always context.
Correct. It's context, and I think like you've been saying, the reverse diet in decreasing or increasing energy availability is probably better suited to those females who aren't getting to the the 12%, but are probably hovering around the 16 and want to stay somewhere around there, semi-lean, photo shoot ready at any stage kind of thing, because they can walk calories up, bring it down, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. So yeah, and again, as always, we people forget about the context of what's going on.
And on this, I just wanted your opinion on this. I would say that you could almost approach the same with weight class athletes and powerlifters in getting them down to their body weight and then into competition. So. Something I've done with a lot of my female powerlifters when they have to make weight is bring calories down as quickly as possible, but then walk them up to as high as possible. Within the time frame of their competition, so they're making weight, but on as many calories possible, and we're reversing that, all the adaptations.
And weight class athletes have the added advantage that they can use that rapid weight loss at the very end. Correct. Like they're as long as they're depending on weigh in, as long as they're within 3 to 5%, they don't necessarily have to do it with diet. Sometimes they do. it gets depending on their goal weight class, depending on how much, what their weight is now. If they've got a 2-hour weigh-in, they're in a very different situation versus a 24-hour weigh-in. I'm training a female powerlifter, and luckily her federation has a 24-hour weigh-in.
It makes a difference.
Which is great. She trains at 120 and she competes at 114. And I don't even start anything as long as we've tracked for the last few meets. And as long as she's about 120 and a half or so on a Sunday, we can get her there. And I do just a very traditional, I don't really water load. We just we cut the fiber out. We start cutting her carbs down. We keep her fats high. I don't want her dieting. I just want her reducing carbs. Water starts to drop. We've seen it takes a couple days. She starts sending me crazy ass emails about, I'm not going to make it. I'm like, we know how your pattern is. And then, she might have to sauna a little bit the night before, glass of wine, whatever, a little bit, herbal diuretic. She'll weigh in at 9 a.m. and then she'll compete at 121. I have never known someone who could eat like this, but so she competes where she trains, but she still comes in at 113.5.
I think that's important too. Is once you have made weight, obviously if you have the benefit of a 24-hour weigh-in versus 2. But even if you have a 2-hour weigh-in and you can handle the food, is to try and get back to the body weight
as much as you can.
Yeah.
But there's certainly there's I remember I look back at my high school, and I went to high school in the 80s, and I watched what our wrestlers did. And you want to talk about pathological practices, the spitting in a cup, the eating nothing but watermelon the day before because the actual weight of the food was more important than the calorie value, which is true. But you get these guys that are having to they'll scream down to make weight, and then they'll rebound by 10 or 15 pounds. And, some of that depends on your competition schedule. Powerlifters are not competing weekly. Wrestlers are. And if you're rebounding 5 or 10 pounds every week, you are having to go through hell weekly to make it. Whereas if they would stay, and one of the papers I saw, I think, that talked about that said, should try to stay within 2 to 3% of your weight class. Because again, like that fitness model, if they rebound to 20 and they got to be at 15 in a month, they're losing money. They are hurting their profession. And if you are a strength power athlete or weight class athlete and you are 10% above your body weight, there's Reed Real has done, a really good guy. He's done a lot of research.
Another Aussie.
What's that? Oh, yeah. Super. I contacted him a while back via email because women have sort of separate issues. And, he's like, I listened to a podcast of mine that was excellent. He's like, you can do 10% with a 24-hour weigh-in. I don't know that I would ever, unless I had to, put somebody through that because that's hell.
I did it for a world record, though.
Sure. And in that case, you do what you got to do. But
60-kilo female, lost 6 kilos overnight. That's nuts. And went out and set 3 world records in the JPS. Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing. The average person, don't bother. If you've got world records on the line, if you got gold medals on the line, you do what it takes. But it happens. And if for her getting to that lower weight class meant that, well, she had to go. My lifter
would never do that for a local athlete or just an amateur competitor.
Even my lifter, she was ready. She was potentially setting some age group world records, and we knew that fed scale was heavy, and they wouldn't acknowledge it. It really annoyed me, quite honestly. Their response was, "Oh, it'll just improve your Wilks." Anyway, she had to lose an extra pound to be safe, and on a 120-pound female, had that extra half a kilo. She suffered. We boiled her, we steamed her. She went through hell. She made it, but she went through hell to get there. And as so yes, if you can keep within that small range, it saves you having to do that. So that is another place absolutely where do as much as you can with rapid weight loss. Like do as much as you can that you're not even manipulating food intake, calorie levels. You're manipulating, fiber content and carb intake and that sort of stuff. If you have to diet, yeah, absolutely do it as gradually as you can in both directions. Again, we've got the situation, a female powerlifter or strength, power, and weight class athlete, they're not competing at 12%. And again, I think this is one of the big distinctions. They typically, 15, 16%, unless they really have, maybe a little bit higher. So they're not really flirting with the menstrual cycle dysfunction. They're also not dieting for those extended periods of time. They're not doing a 6-month chronic low-calorie diet. Physique is just its own weird thing that has these. It's not even performance-based. Runners, cyclists, like I said, they have the advantage of they're doing, runners are doing 2-hour runs once or twice a week. Cyclists are doing 30 hours in the saddle. They can be in a deficit and still eat a lot of food. And a small physique athlete is maybe on 1,400 calories, which no matter how you do it is not much food to be eating. And they have their own set of considerations.
Awesome. I think that a lot of listeners will see a lot of benefit in what we've just discussed, Lyle. And, I guess the final thing I wanted to discuss on that was, specific hormone levels and females getting labs done and checking for imbalances and things like this, to just make sure that, they're not in any way, shape or form, in those two, subclinical categories of amonerhia. I guess I'll load you with a couple of questions. If you can just fire these off as quickly as can. What type of lab should they be seeking? At what stage during their cycle, if they're still getting menses, and how frequently for that to be useful?
Yeah, so first let me say, this is, once you get sort of into this realm, it's a little bit outside my area, but I can sort of tell you what the general approaches are, right? So very briefly, the women's menstrual cycle, the average is 28 days. It's split in the middle at ovulation. First 2 weeks, follicular phase. Estrogen is the dominant hormone. Second 2 weeks, luteal phase. Progesterone tends to be kind of the dominant hormone, and estrogen is a little bit lower. And they kind of so estrogen will start here at the day one, sweep up, peak right before ovulation, crash back down, and then progesterone and estrogen will come up and then loop back down at the end of the cycle. So typically, and this is a problem, is when you measure a woman's hormones, will give you a completely different picture, right? If you do the what's called the early follicular week 1, you should see very low estrogen and progesterone. If you do 3 days before ovulation, you should see very high estrogen and low progesterone. First week of the luteal phase will look different than the middle, will look different than the final. So you frequently may have to either do multiple tests within a month. This has actually been an issue in research, is determining where in a woman's cycle she is. Because while these are these average durations, the only day a woman can identify conclusively is the first day of menstruation. That is day 1 by definition. Everything else is a guess to a degree. There's the increase in basal body temperature that indicates ovulation. Some women swear they can feel it, and there's often a change in their behavior. Actually, it's usually they become more hornier, basically, for lack of, because that's when they're fertile. There's a spike of testosterone. It's all these things going on. If a woman is prone to premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that would typically indicate the 4th week of the cycle, but some women get it earlier. So early studies were really bad. They just asked women to basically estimate, and that's useless. That's so ideally you would do mid follicular, and there's normal hormone levels. There's norms, clinical norms, mid luteal, and there's clinical norms, but there's all a really big range. So I don't even really know. Frequently in studies they'll use ultrasound to determine when ovulation has occurred. But we're now getting into some serious clinical level stuff that I don't really, what I would say is that if a woman just gets a spot test, she just goes in spot check on her hormones, it's meaningless. Unless she has some general idea of where she is in her cycle, her estrogen could be anywhere in this range, and it won't, knowing that it's here within this doesn't really tell you anything. Yeah. So I would expect that, an OBGYN would find some way to determine where, and look at least mid follicular, mid luteal. That's typically what the studies use, because they give sort of the best average So, day 7, day 21 is typically on a 28-day cycle. This is complicated by the fact that the menstrual cycle can range anywhere from 24 to 32 days. So this is assuming a 28-day cycle. What you typically see, right? So we've got the normal menstrual cycle. Like I said, estrogen starts low, sweeps high before ovulation, crashes back down, and then both progesterone and estrogen go up. With that luteal phase defect, generally what's happening is that progesterone will be lower. Estrogen may be lower as well, but typically progesterone, and progesterone is responsible for maintaining the endometrial lining, which is where the egg develops for pregnancy if it's fertilized. And so that's kind of the first step is there's not enough or it's not going high enough. Progesterone is not going up sufficiently to maintain that. And that's also part of why the luteal phase, but again, the follicular phase may lengthen. So the cycle length may not change, but the relative proportions. Going into anovulation, estrogen will be low because that big spike of estrogen, follicle stimulating hormone, will be lost. That's what causes the follicle to burst and release the egg. So at that point, you would typically see an overall lowering of estrogen and progesterone. And I think in the book, I talk about how, essentially, and this is the bone mineral, essentially these are all low estrogen states to one degree or another. But it's I think on average, progesterone gets hit earliest, then estrogen and progesterone. And by the time you're amenorrheic, estrogen is 1/3 of normal all the way through the cycle. Progesterone's 10% because progesterone is released from the egg. The egg is what's producing is progesterone. So when it's no longer being released, you're not getting progesterone production. The ovaries produce estrogen due to luteinizing hormone. So when levels of that go down, estrogen is no longer being produced, at least in the bloodstream. So that would be kind of the general. Like I said, the problem is that there's really no indication. I mean, it can be assumed that it's occurring at some point. And actually, another researcher named D'Souza, when they first realized that these subclinical disorders existed, they took college women, and even exercising only 2 hours a week caused a fairly large, 30% or something, to develop luteal phase defect. Women's systems are just super, 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 super sensitive to this stuff in a way that men's just aren't, right? And it's hard to tell. I doubt food intake was controlled. A lot of college women are perpetually dieting. There's a lot going on, and then as exercise volume went up, the percentage and the severity kind of increased. So it would kind of be those, looking at those pictures, and the thing is, even there, you need a baseline. Right, you need to know, because women do show variance even during the normal menstrual cycle, where their relative levels of estrogen and progesterone
so is it a
are
waste
high.
of time?
Part of me thinks yes, because it's kind of one of those things that it's going to happen, and there's really nothing you can do about it. It's and I'm kind of the opinion. I see guys online. Oh, should I get my hormones tested? I don't gain muscle easily. Should I get my hormones tested? And my question is always, well, what are you going to do with that information? If your test comes back and it says you have low testosterone, now what? If you're not going to go on hormone replacement, if you're not going to take drugs, what is this information giving you that you don't already know? So I'm kind of certainly if a woman, again, context, if a woman's trying to get pregnant, and can't, now we're dealing with a medical issue. Now we're dealing with a very different goal. She needs to go find out what is the cause of her infertility. Now, an easy one, she could very much look at her calorie intake and her activity, there's this subpopulation of women that seem to be able to mentally stress themselves into amenorrhea. They're usually perfectionists who are very sensitive to external validation, which is, I'd say, every physique athlete ever.
Definitely.
Again, I'm not trying to just be a shit to be a shit. It is what it is. You can't be a front man on a band if you're not a narcissist. You can't. Yeah. It's part of the personality profile. Every job tends to have an optimal personality. If you're not a narcissist, you're not going to get up on stage in front of 1 million people. Period. If you don't really care, if you're not very body oriented, if you don't really care what other people think, you don't want to get on stage in your posing trunks, right? I'm not saying it it is what it is. It comes with the territory. We just have to acknowledge it and work with it. The women that have this, they describe them as dealing poorly with daily hassles. And I find it utterly amusing that that clinical research refers to it as hassles. I just think that's so great. So you typically, sort of an overreactive stress system. There is that group who's just a little tightly wound, but women could look, look at the simple. Look at the simple stuff. If you've got that high stress profile, maybe all you really need is meditation or mindfulness or something to get you to just chill the hell out. Wine culture, or whatever. If you know that you're prone to undereating and overexercising, well, and that's been kind of the current thing now that we know that energy availability is really the key. Is that they've got questionnaires and all this other stuff, but it's like, okay, just look at how much you're actually eating, look at how much your activity is. You can rough calculate energy availability. If you're a woman trying to get pregnant and your energy available, well, it may be as simple as that, but it may not be. Women's reproductive systems can, PCOS is one of the most. It's something like 20 to 25% of all infertile women are diagnosed with PCOS. Mm-hmm. That is one of the absolutely most common. And part of the problem there is there's multiple kinds of PCOS. One does tend to be associated with elevated testosterone. And again, there will be clear signs. Those women tend to carry a more male-like fat pattern. They tend to be more muscular. They may have oily skin, slight hair loss, acne, extra body hair. Like that's typical, but not all of them do. The hyperandrogenism is not always part of that. So that you can also be lean. PCOS is also associated with obesity, which is its own cause of infertility. But there is a lean type of PCOS woman that may have, but again, that can be measured they can ultrasound to see if there are cysts on the ovaries. Insulin resistance is a hallmark of it. Typically they are amenorrheic or have oligomenorrhea. These are kind of these are the diagnostic criteria for this. So if a woman is trying to get pregnant and can't, despite, doing everything right, in terms of tracking body temperature, whatever, then I think that's a case where it's worth getting a medical workup to see, again, if she can't identify very simple problems. But again, if I had a woman who just emailed me and said, you know what, I don't even train and I don't really watch my food intake and I'm not overweight and I can't I'd say go to a doctor because this is something medical. And with women, it can be a million different things.